So thank you for joining this meeting, Louidgi Beltrame and Minia Biabiany. We are here to talk about the different practices we are engaged with. Also because we're all involved in an exhibition at Pivô in São Paulo, which I am curating, and both Minia and Louidgi are showing works, and I think there is an opportunity to discuss the different lines of research and different interests that we share that kind of float around the themes of the exhibition, which I have to say I don't have complete clarity about, because it's an exhibition that it's a bit intuitive in the sense that it comes from different projects that I have been developing, and maybe one that it's particularly relevant recently is the exhibition I co-curated with Elvira Turpin in the Alsace, in Alkirch, where Minia was one of the artists, and well, Louidgi was able to see thoroughly. So I guess one of the themes or issues or interests in this show was very much the mediation between what we call the visible and the invisible, and the practices that people employ to, let's say, get in touch with what we call the invisible, and that are practices that are rooted in certain cultures or in certain contexts, but also that are constantly evolving and changing. And I was thinking of this book by René Daumal, where he says the gateway to the invisible is the visible, no? Because they're trying to reach this mountain analog where you cannot see it, and it's supposed to be the tallest mountain. You can only see it at certain time when the light is bending. And it was obviously written when the theory of relativity was being formulated. And I think this is a very nice kind of analogy to this, a sort of scientific fictional analogy to this idea of seeing through, or seeing the invisible through the visible, no? Or getting in touch. And since you are both artists and very much involved with visual culture, I think that's an interesting point as well to make, how through images and spatial experiences, there can be these practices of mediation. So yeah, I don't know if any of you want to start talking a bit about your practices and what kind of involvement you've had with these ideas that I just mentioned.
Yeah. I can start. So yes, maybe I can just describe what was the installation I made for the show you just talked about, Le Jour des Esprits Autrui. And so the piece was called Qui vivra verra, qui mourra saura. So we will see, we'll live, we'll see, we will die, we'll know. And so that piece was really thought based on the Creole Garden, which is a very particular and specific space around the house that we have in Guadeloupe and in several parts of the Caribbean. And so the Creole Garden is that cultural element that is the first moment in space where the enslaved has values the land where he lives in, and is not only used for exploiting the land of the colonizer. And so the Creole garden has this particularity of being taken care of by the enslaved, but it's its own space in the sense of he decides how he wants to cultivate it and what it's inside. And so inside the Creole garden, there are plants that are linked with magical beliefs, religious beliefs, also some plants that are just for decoration, let's say, and a lot of plants that are related with medicinal properties, that have medicinal properties. So when you first look at it, you don't understand the structure. It looks like a big house, but finally some plants are always placed in some parts of the garden, and this localization of some plants is actually related with their protection properties or protection roles. And so in Guadeloupe, we have completely lost that knowledge or that understanding and those beliefs related with those plants concerning the magic, concerning the protection. But we still have them in the gardens, and we still have them actually in a quite accurate position. But still they are used respecting a kind of structure. So in the installation at the Catalzats, I decided to have a plan of a typical house of just after the end of slavery in Guadeloupe. So very, very small house, only with doors, with no windows. And the doors and the entrances were materialized by ceramics, hand ceramics. And then around that, to have, so in front as a house, TV Havira, so we will see. And so that plant had the property to protect the one living in the house. And in the back of the house, I hung ceramics that were Qui mourra saura, so who will die will know. And who will die will know have had the property to keep the knowledge inside the house. So I very in a very simple way put hang the ceramics reproducing the shapes of the leaves, and around that have two other parts of the garden that are more like the rest of the plants, and then the vegetation, the relation with the spirits, and that idea of having a space that is complex and constituted by all those relations. So yes, that was the installation, and the light was blue and red. We put some filters on the windows, and so when we entered in the room, we had both those. A part where the light was red and another part where the light was blue, and this because in the house of the traditional healers that have both the function of heal, but also sometimes to be like the attacking one. So they have both this function of helping people, but also sometimes not helping. Their house back in times, like back in, I think now it's really harder to find, but their house had walls painted in red and blue, so it was also an allusion to that. So yes, the installation.
I was thinking maybe you could talk about the materials you chose, because I think also there is a certain significance in the, like drawing the plan of the house with salt, and kind of thinking of the materiality, not only in this work, but in others, how you choose the materials you work with, and kind of the let's say, semantic weight they have in the work.
Mm-hmm. So in that installation, I worked with ceramics and with salt. So the salt had that, I choose to work with salt because salt is really used in many rituals to clean. To have this energetical, because of this energetical capacity of cleaning spaces, cleaning entities in many cultures, not only in Guadeloupe. And all the construction of the garden and the localization of the plants was based on that idea of having the need to protect oneself or the house of all the inhabitants of the house, and to have to protect to be protected of the jealousy, envy of the neighbors. So the garden is both something you kind of show, because it shows that you have the green hand, we say in French, the possibility, the capacity to grow things well. So you kind of show off the garden, but also it has to be a little hidden because you don't want to provoke envy, jealousy, etc. So the salt, I choose the salt because of that constant care of having enough protection, being protected enough. And the ceramic came more in a more intuitive way, let's say, but it was also the connection with soil, the idea of working with a material that was organic. And in general, in my work, I made some different types of investigation on traditional crafts and crafting techniques in Guadeloupe, particularly on one that is the nas, which are fish traps that are not used anymore, made in bamboo, but they're still used, made in other materials like plastic and metal. And so in one of my installations called Toli Toli, I really made that investigation to find again this gesture to make that bamboo weaving. And it was really interesting because then I could understand better the relation with the moon cycle, because when you have to cut the bamboo, you have to pay attention on where is the feeding liquid of the plant for the insect not to attack it. So it was a whole new understanding of the relation also with time, with cycle. And when I did that work, I was coming back to live in Guadeloupe after more than 10 years abroad. So I was also in a very strong observation moment, also observing a lot how was the silence around the political situation of Guadeloupe, how that silence was built, and how the relation with the land was, what was the role of that relation in the situation, the global situation. So Guadeloupe is a French territory until today, has never been independent. And so it's an island in the Caribbean. So the assimilation process, the French assimilation process has been continued. And there is a disconnection with the land that is very particular, and also a relation with language that is very particular, because we speak Creole and French. The official language is French, but the Creole has that status of being the language connected with emotions, with all also a certain class, like workers, and it has been devaluated a lot, but then reevaluated a lot. So in that work, so totally the relation with weaving was for me, weaving was a metaphor of storytelling. And so I was looking for a craft, a technique that was forming a surface, forming a writing that I could relate with the title. So I choose that weaving technique in bamboo of the fish traps. And yes, the idea was to make in that installation, to have a video that could bring a poetry of the voice of the land in a way that, but also that poetry could impact the way the spectator is going through the space. So it was a back and forth between the images of the video that is called Toli Toli 2 and the installation itself.
Toli Toli, montrez-moi chemin à Casamance. Toli Toli, montrez-moi qui j'en pouvine côté site. Doucou, ou tellement douce. The fruit lays on the floor. The peel is rubbing itself inside, while the outside is put out, vulnerable. We see the seeds, here, Leeward Islands. Toli Toli reads time.
Great. Thank you, Minia. So maybe, Louidgi, you could introduce a little bit the relationship you've built with Jose and with Peru through your work that has now a long history perhaps, and also that it's very related to filmmaking and all that filmmaking implies in a way.
Yes. What I can say is that I've been working in Peru since 2012. First project was Nosotros también somos extraterrestres, which was a project with Victor Costellas, who was an actor in the film, and we went on the ground in Nazca Lines in the south of Peru. I saw for the first time an archaeological site called El Brujo. This site was very impressive. It's on the northern coast, facing the Pacific. And it's 3 pyramids and an open ground with open graves, a lot of desert, a lot of sand. And somehow this site stayed in my mind after the trip, and I couldn't escape of thinking of the ending of the 400 Blows by François Truffaut, the famous movie from '59, where Jean-Pierre Léaud was a very young actor. He was 14 at the time. And the last scene, which is one of the very iconic scene of the French Nouvelle Vague cinema, is the young Jean-Pierre Léaud escaping the adolescent reformatory where he was staying and running to see the sea for the first time. So it was in the same movement and escape and discovery. And I had also in mind the image of the older Jean-Pierre Léaud, who is now in his 70s and who looks more and more like maybe Antonin Artaud, searching for the Tarahumaras and their famous peyote in the mountain in Mexico. And somehow the geography, the topography of the site was really the same as the beach in Normandy, where Truffaut shot this very famous traveling And I had this strange idea of making a switch between North and South, and between 59 and 2015, and brings a kind of a loose reenactment with Jean-Pierre Léaud nowadays on this beach of El Bruro at the antipodes in time and space. And I contacted Léaud, who is very well versed in occultism and anthropology also somehow, and philosophy, and we started a discussion. He accepted the project as only if I could manage to put him in touch with a person of power, what he was saying, and who was a kind of a curandero or shaman, no? Like a traditional healer. And it was the exchange that he proposed, that he would come and then we would have a night with some interprets talking and spending a night with this person. And through a network of anthropologists, Peruvian anthropologists in Paris, I got in touch with José Levis Picon Saguma, who is a traditional healer from the north of Peru, but living now in the south, and who is working with K plant, like a planta maestra, which is the cactus San Pedro. It's a mescalinian cactus, and he works with it in a kind of collective ceremonies. So I think it's connecting also with Minia's garden somehow, because herbalism is a very strong thing in Peru. It's this relationship of, se dice herbalismo, and it's a relationship of protection and comprehension between the plants and the healer and the patient. No, it's like, and it's very strong, still a very strong relation. I met José Levis, and he agreed for us to meet after the shooting. So everything was settled. I got the authorization granted to shoot in La Huaca El Brujo, which was quite complicated. And then Jean-Pierre Léaud was shooting a film with Albert Serra, The Death of Louis XIV, fall ill, and he couldn't come at the last limit. So I was blocked in Peru with a small budget. I already had a team with a Steadicam and everything. And it was quite complicated to handle and impossible to postpone. No? And then I had this idea to go back to see José Levis and ask him if, from the point of view of his practice, somehow he could handle the absence of Jean-Pierre and work for his well-being on a distance. No? And it would be a way to switch the perspective of the project, no? And to kind of not ritualize it, but really play between these two energies, which were Jean-Pierre Léaud and his desire to meet this curandero. And so I went to see him, and he was very surprised by my question. And he said somehow that I should come to see his work, and maybe I could participate to one of these ceremonies, and then we could talk further. And so I went once just to see the situation in the suburb of Lima. It was in a very clandestine space because it's still very marginal as a practice. It was very repressed at the time of Inquisition, of course, and still under the dictatorship. It was also very repressed, and still it's not officially legal to practice the mesa. So I went there, and I was really charmed enchanted by the ceremony. And I decided to go south, where he has his main ritual space, and to practice one of these ceremonies with him. And we spent the day watching the 400 Blows by Truffaut. He was asking me a lot of questions about Jean-Pierre Léaud and how he was behaving. And it was funny because in my head, I had Jean-Pierre Léaud 70-year-old, but on the film he's 14. And so José had the image of 14-year-old. So I brought a piece of paper with a printed photo of Jean-Pierre nowadays. And then I took the ceremony came, and I took the San Pedro cactus, and somehow I felt like I embodied Jean-Pierre Léaud from a distance, no? Like all the information he had on me has been working on me with some stick, with some stones, with different magic objects. Finally, we flew with the shaman to the north of Peru, to the site of El Burro, and he embodied himself the absence of Jean-Pierre Léaud. So he did the run as Jean-Pierre did 50 years before, and this famous glaze at the camera, which is at the end of the 400 blows. And it was like a loop was looped. No? Somehow when I came back to France, Jean-Pierre was much better, and we could shoot a mirror sequence in the street of Paris. And it was like, yeah, magic, like Jean-Pierre was walking again, and we wrote a small trajectory in Paris linked to his reminiscence of the shooting of the 400 blows. And so the film is made of two sequences. The sequence in Peru was José is running and reenacting this last shot of the 400 blows, and the shot with Jean-Pierre Léaud in Paris. And also he gave to my friend Elfie an occult stick from the 19th century that he wanted the shaman to bless and to cleanse. And so I shot a small Super 8 film on the top of a pyramid. It was an improvisation by the shaman who was blowing perfume and whistling also, because the work happened a lot with whistling and singing. And then I did some superpositions with Jean-Pierre receiving his magic stick in Paris. And so the work was made with these two films. And then, of course, for me, it changed a lot of things. I went also to see for a few ceremonies afterwards. One ceremony of ayahuasca with a friend of José, who is a maestro from the Selva, from Amazonia. Because in Peru, you have three main plantas maestras. You have the San Pedro cactus on the coast, on the Pacific coast. In the mountains, in the Sierra, you have the coca leaves. And in Amazonia, you have a lot of ayahuasca. And a few months after, I did a show in Palais de Tokyo, and I went with the work, and I went back to see José because it's really kept in my mind, and to spend some time with him, spend a little bit more time with his extended family, and talking with him. He told me that there was a kind of trend of shamanism, of course, this kind of psychedelic tourism developing and spiritual tourism. And that he didn't think that this was not okay, but what he thought was not okay is that a lot of people are opening like health center and things, and are not ready to work because they didn't have any formation or any apprenticeship about the plants and things, and that there was a bad use of the plantas maestras, which in the worst case can be dangerous for the patient, but it's also a lot of loss of knowledge, like traditional knowledge. And he was afraid with that, and that he always refused to be filmed while working. But he said that I think it's also because of the friendship that we developed through this strange project, El Burro. He decided that I could come to film him. And he requested that I could stay 2 or 3 months and stay with them, and to meet also his patients and his extended family, not to just come and make like a documentary piece, but more to share time and space together. And also like a kind of alliance and to make an exchange. Now we're still in touch, and I was supposed to see him this summer, but I think I will go next year. And so we had a kind of rendezvous for 1 year after, for 2017. And one big question was that the mesa happened in total darkness. There is not even a cigarette lit on, because it would cut the vision of the curandero. And so he couldn't give his diagnosis about the patients. And he told me, but this is your stuff, you have to somehow deal with it, and I'm sure you will find a technique or something. And also you have to keep in mind that you have to be light and come with no crew. It will be you only in the space, and the patients and the assistants and myself. So I had 1 year to research about a display to film Rosé, and maybe this is joining the question of invisibility that you were asking also somehow in a very concrete way also, because of course Rosé is working with a lot of what we could call the invisible being or different ontologies also. But I was confronted also to this question of how do you film, how do you show something which is supposed first to be clandestine, to be at the margins, and also something which is happening literally in the dark.
Well, I think it's interesting. I was thinking as you were speaking of this idea that traditional, what it's been called traditional knowledge, in opposition to Western sort of legitimized knowledge, is very often passed through orality and through practices that are not recorded, like in the sort of Western epistemological sort of systems of recording knowledge. And that's why also they're very vulnerable to misuse or to being lost, as Minia was saying, no? The impact of colonialism in how Guadeloupe developed as a territory, and how the knowledge of the enslaved becomes very fragile in this very crushing power of the colonizer, and how this knowledge is very often lost or very easily lost, and how people like Jose or the few maybe traditional healers that still are in Guadeloupe have a very, very essential, important knowledge that is only transmitted through, well, maybe not only, but also transmitted through these practices, no? And through the knowledge of the plants, that is something that you cannot really translate into language as such, as speaking, but it's kind of codified through different, or through other means, I guess. So I was thinking of that. Yeah, I mean, you were talking about also the collective nature of these ceremonies and how they kind of need to be collective because there is a particular, I guess, energy that is created through the collectivity and through the sort of collective effort that is healing also, no? Because I think I was thinking of this idea that healing is something that has to happen collectively, like you can't heal one person, but you're healing kind of a whole sort of order of things where not only humans are involved, but it's a much more complex way of understanding healing practices. And yeah, I mean, you did develop this technology to record or researched this technology to record the ceremonies, which I think is very interesting. So maybe you can talk briefly about that, and then Minia can maybe continue talking about these issues.
So I developed a way to enlight the ritual space with infrared projectors, and I got normal HD camera transformed to get a full spectrum camera, which allowed me to film the infrared and UV lights. So I was totally in the deep dark and filming only through the window of my camera. And I spent like 12 nights filming on about 2 months of shooting, and did a very long editing, like 2-hour 50 piece, and mixing the 12 nights and keeping the order of the development of the ceremony from the beginning until the morning. including the dance and the ceremony. It's a very well-crafted ceremony. It's super choreographed with some individual passages and effectively collective passages. And for Rosé, it's very important, this idea of community. Like you don't take a rendezvous to go to the mesa, it's just the open doors. It's in the suburb of this little town. And in the night, you see the light of the cars appearing and coming, or people coming, walking. And sometimes you will have 10 persons, sometimes 40. Each mesa has its own energy. And Rosé is easily talking about group therapy about it, because there is a part, it starts with some collective dancing and singing, like a warming up somehow of the body. And then he sees some portraits and clothes that the people are bringing from a member of their family or something, and he can read through the objects and talk with the people, the accompagnants. And then there is the individual passages, so the patients are passing and dancing. It's also the plant which is directing the whole ceremony. Everyone is connected through this, through the plant. The shamans, the assistants, all the patients are taking the plant. And so it creates a kind of link. When Rosé addresses the San Pedro, he's addressing the San Pedro as a person, no? And it's quite funny because sometimes he's calling the San Pedro Yarbita, which is feminine, and sometimes he calls it San Pedrito, which is masculine. No, the plant is transgender somehow, or gender fluid. No, it's like he addresses with many sweet names. No, like also this very lot of sweet naming like that in Peru, and so the plant has many names, and the name come back, Yarbita or San Pedrito, always in the singing. And then when the person passes, he's whistling and singing all the diagnosis to the assistants, and they're working with some sticks, special sticks with sculptures and special wood and stone and huacos, object artifacts coming from pre-Columbian graves that he selects for their special power, and also perfumes and different distillation of plants. And the first diagnosis is public, no? Like all the people are sitting on bench in the dark, so you just see a shadow moving and the singing, and he's giving his diagnosis in public. Sometimes he would have a vision which has nothing to do with the situation, like red shoes drowning into a high mountain lake in the Andes, and the water getting troubled. For example, I'm taking an example like that out of context. And from this, he starts to ask questions to the dancer, to the person, and he asks questions also to the people which are sitting just nearby, who are person of trust. And then after this different, it's like a bit like he's watching the aura of the person also. And then he go out with the person, and then he deliver an individual and maybe more personal diagnosis.
I was thinking maybe it'd be interesting to talk about these practices that are kind of born in colonial contexts, because they're really born in the tensions that coloniality creates, and I think they often represent a lot of those tensions in the very, like in the elements they use, and also I was thinking maybe Minia could talk about this idea of protection and of knowledge embedded in a colonial context, because as you said, Guadeloupe has always kind of, or for like the past few hundred years, has been a colony, and how that how that idea of knowledge and passing knowledge is also against colonialism in a way. It's against the background of colonialism.
Well, in Guadeloupe, the context also is that native population, the Kalinago, or Kalina, it was a almost complete genocide And so the people of the Caribbean were moving to the Caribbean. They were not limited to one island. So at some point, so they, of course, resisted really, really peacefully and long to the invasion. And when they were reduced to slavery, they preferred to suicide. And so the rest of that population of native, so you had different population in the Caribbean, but the one concerning Guadeloupe, the Catalina, they were brought to Dominica, which is the island north of Guadeloupe, and parked in a reserve. And very few remained after maybe it's 50 years of colonization. I mean, it's been a very, very fast process of destruction of a population and its knowledge. So when the African came enslaved, the transmission between the one inhabiting the land in centuries and the one brought by force has been very little. Depending on the island, you can find more, sometimes like in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Dominican Republic. There were more, because those islands are also bigger, the Maroons could also develop other strategies. And so the native and the Maroons often had an alliance. So the knowledge could be transmitted in another way, but in Guadeloupe, it's actually quite harsh. The rupture, the cut in between the two population and the two relation with the land is very strong. And so to talk about how that knowledge is now existing, so big switch and jump in time. Nowadays, what I observe like at the most, the key elements is really school and education. And so how the fact that the teachings in the school are completely based on French structure. So slowly, with the years and people fighting, more and more elements of the Caribbean and Caribbean history are integrated very, very slowly. But I see a rupture also of generation between my parents that grew up in a system that was still very, very strongly related with slavery plantation. So when my parents are describing where I live now in their childhood, it's really marked by I don't know, the church, the bell ringing in each plantation for the workers to start working. My grandmother had a little food shop when she was selling like the basics, but she was selling to the workers of the plantation. The ruptures between class were extremely marked. They still are today, but it was really a plantation system. And what is also interesting is to understand how from after the abolition of slavery, which was actually not a real abolition of slavery, but more a reorganization of the power, and still the one that were enslaved were now free. But in reality, they were attached to a plantation. They were earning special money that could be only used on that plantation, etc. So the relation with power was also extremely complex. And so the plant and the medicinal knowledge has been a survival knowledge, also linked with magic and natural forces. But in Guadeloupe, it could not take the same importance, complexity, and it was a prohibited practice. And it's not like in Haiti, for example, where both the language Creole and the magical practice like Voodoo could really take a full space in the collective healing, collective practices, collective relations. In Guadeloupe, it has been kept very secret. And even nowadays, when so there is a lot of magic, and part of it is black magic, and that black magic or all those practices are not considered as they cannot be made public. So you go see the Gade d'Affaires, it's a really a hidden practice, and the only reason why this relation with the forest, with healing, with nature is not valued as such as a practice that could be collective is French assimilation. It's because the church and it's seen as something bad and that you have to be ashamed of. But what is also happening is that the direct relation with the land in terms of, let's say, the hurricanes that we have every year. We live in a volcanic island, so we have a living being under earth that is sometimes talking, sometimes no, but sometimes silent. But all the relation with a land that is so specific, by some families it's valued, and you can have for example, in my case, I have an uncle that has an incredible knowledge about nature, and so I feed myself now that I have the conscience that yes, I want to know that. But otherwise, it's also very easy just to be in a capitalist conception bubble. So that I think my point here is the notion of collective here is extremely complex because of those different ruptures, and also, of course, the colonizers and the descendants of the colonizers are the culture is really fragmented here. At the same time, there is a common identity, but still the tensions are very present. So the idea of collective is still something quite complex to define. And I think so the relation with the land is also depending on that ability to understand what is collective here, and we are still figuring that out.
I was thinking as you were talking also about something Louidgi said before about Jose calling the San Pedro Yerbita or San Pedrito, and that I think has to do with a shift of, or like a realization of the importance of recognizing the personhood of non-humans. So how that implies a completely different conception of how we relate to what until now has been bluntly called nature as something separated from humans, like we, or like, yeah, the sort of dominant ideology has been to separate humans from nature and make nature servant to humans. And I think now more and more we are recognizing the importance of these other ontologies, indigenous ontologies, that kind of completely change this organization of how we relate to other beings, and how we, if we recognize the personhood of those beings, we can even have a legal system that kind of creates rights for those entities, non-human entities that have the right to survive as humans would ideally. So I was thinking maybe also you could talk about a little bit about your recent work on the Musa paradisiaca, which is also a plant that is very related to colonialism and to the circulation of species in the colonial world, but that also has these other layers of meaning and significance depending on where you are, but specifically in Guadeloupe, perhaps.
So yes, the last work I've done is Musa Nuit. So it's an installation, and part of that installation is a video called Musa. And Musa is the Latin name for banana tree. And so what was interesting for me was the question of the heritage of history in female bodies, and especially in sexuality, the relation with pleasure, and the relation between lineage and historical trauma. So my starting point to start thinking of that huge question was the flower of the banana tree, because it has the property, one of the properties of that flower is to heal the uterus. And so I started to think also about, so the video is really a kind of how I'm using, again, the same time of weaving between the image, the voice, and the text that is written. But what the question I was somehow bringing, so I'm bringing slowly through the video, is that idea of the body also as a healing tool, and to understand also how with our own body we can go back to another, or must say, I don't know if it's go back, but it's we can discover, we can hear, we can listen, we can communicate differently if we also get a bigger understanding of what is a body. And so in the video, the idea is to talk about the relation we have with our own bodies itself, and that communication is not something defined or closed. And so somehow that question is addressing the relation that we inherited from West, let's put that way, or like this rupture between mind and spirit, this rupture between culture and nature, you know? And but all it's really my understanding and my experience of how through listening and through observation we can actually receive more. And so communication is not closed, and how we give value again to that communication.
Curl over and dissolve into foam. Cut hand, cut feet, cut lips, cut filament, shocked. The petal of Musa gets so tense that it breaks and falls on my feet. Moment de l'eau.
I think we're gonna have to wrap up, because otherwise we'll be talking here forever. And there are lots of things that we could continue talking about, but I thought it was important to kind of introduce these ideas that are very much related to the exhibition in Brazil, in Pivô, called A Natural History of Ruins, which, I mean, the title is the title I've been working with for a long time, and I hadn't found the project to use it, and finally I did. And of course, it's a title that refers to a very colonial science that is natural history of, or no, it's not a science, a very colonial narrative that is natural history. but also in relation to these very pressing ecological issues that we're dealing with. So I was interested in using that precisely because it's one of the fields I've been working on, the sort of history of natural history as a history of colonization as well, and of colonial institutions, and to somehow undo these narratives. And I remember when the museum in Rio de Janeiro burned to the ground. There were many issues that were very relevant to what we're talking now that were embedded in that burning of that collection and of that history of colonization and of cultures. And I don't know. I thought it was interesting to talk to both of you because although your practices are very different in form, let's say, there are many connections that can be made in these difference, and also because it's they are also produced in very different contexts. So I think it's interesting, and I'm very interested to see how this will develop in Brazil, where obviously there is a very big tradition of thinking,
of course,
and of sort of traditional in very big practices. I guess tradition can be understood also as against progress, but not as a stagnated state of affairs, but more as a let's say, I'd like to think it's a bit in contradiction or in tension with the modern notion of progress, to kind of nuance a little bit the term. And so I don't know if you want to add something before we finish.
No, I'm fine.
Me too.
So I hope we meet in person in Brazil in February.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yes,
and we
can forward.
We can continue these conversations and have some cachaça or something.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catalina.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minia.
Louidgi.
See you. Ciao, ciao.